Good morning. Thank you for inviting me to participate in your workshop this morning in Gauteng. I'm sorry that I can't be with you. It's really way too long since I was in Johannesburg. What I'd like to do this morning is to talk through with you what I see happening with travel and tourism around the world. We're still very much, most places in the world, in survival mode. We need to move into recovery, and I think you're further ahead with some of that than certainly we are in Europe at the moment. And then we need to look at renewal. So I'm going to try and cover quite a broad canvas in my half hour or so with you this morning. I'm going to talk about living with COVID. We can't ignore that. I'm going to talk about what we mean by doing tourism better. I'm going to talk with you about whose responsibility it is to make tourism better. Talk about the business case for responsible tourism, and then finally to talk about what I see as the big change which is coming, has come and is going to become even more important to us, the growth of experiential tourism, which I think is a big opportunity for Gauteng, for South Africa and for Africa as a whole. So first of all, let's look at living with COVID. The problem about this is that it's not just a destination problem. You've got tourism and day visitors, all of whom have got to get from home to the destination. But if you think about me traveling to Gauteng, that's from home to the airport, through the airport, onto the plane, the airport on arrival, the transfer, the accommodation, the activities, the attractions, and then back again. And of course, if I'm going to go out in the destination, then I have to consider what the behavior of other people around me will be like in that destination. And there's some countries which have done themselves, I think, a great deal of harm in that respect. South Africa is not one of those, but there are states in America where I think people will be reluctant to travel for some time because of the way they've seen non-compliance with COVID measures, anti-COVID measures. There's also, of course, the risk of lockdown at home, lockdown in the destination, being locked out or quarantined on return, problems about insurance, a lot of uncertainty. And as I said, it's not just a destination issue. We can't ignore the travel question. So it isn't going to be easy to recover and to renew. The second thing we need to remember is that health is going to continue to be an absolute priority. The Gambia is still closed. It closed its borders up in West Africa. In South Africa, you've made more progress and you've been able to open up, but nobody knows whether there will be a return to some degree of lockdown. And of course, although just last night we got the news that the vaccine has been approved for use in the UK, it's going to take a very long time to roll it out around the world. So the recovery is not going to be quick. And many countries like South Africa, I think, will rely heavily on domestic tourism in the short run, because one of the particular problems for South Africa is that you have your main season just as Europe and North America are in their winters with the peaks of coronavirus. That's particularly unfortunate for that kind of north-south holiday traffic. Trust has become the new currency of tourism. There's no question about that. So a lot of trust required given the chain of providers in our complex sector. I need to trust those I'll meet while I'm traveling as well as the people I'll meet in the destination. Now, for a long time, travelers have been able simply to assume their safety, take it for granted. The problem now is, of course, that we've got a situation where people can no longer take their safety for granted. And the research evidence in the UK, for example, shows that significant numbers of people are very reluctant to fly again, probably until they've been vaccinated and feel more secure about the risks of catching it. We also have to face the fact that travel and tourism was an important vector for the spread of the virus. We can't deny our responsibility for that. Travel then has become a risky business. It hasn't been risky for a long time, but it is now. And I think it's going to be for some time to come. So trust is really fundamental to looking forward. I debated long and hard whether to share this with you. But this shows the 1,483 epidemic events in 172 countries over the last 7 years, between 2011 and 2018. What it shows is that the potential for a new pandemic to emerge is clearly there all the time. And it really relies upon the strength of the virus and the strength of the public health response and our ability to isolate the virus very early in the process to stop it happening. I'm only showing you this because it seems to me that we need to be really careful in the industry that we keep awareness of how to deal with this kind of pandemic so that we don't get caught again in quite the same way that we did. We handled SARS and MERS and Zika and Ebola much better than we managed the current pandemic. We're able to block it early in the process. We need to remain vigilant and act quickly against any future emergencies of viruses in this way. One of the things that some destinations have been better at than others is maintaining and creating motivation to visit. I'm as passionate about Scotland as I am about Africa, and it strikes me that Scotland has done particularly well in maintaining the traveller motivation and the connection. I mean, slogans like Scotland needs you. Only in Scotland can travelling make such a big difference. These are excellent slogans. It seems to me that the efforts which have gone into maintaining a relationship with potential visitors, but both people who've been before and potential new visitors, are really important in the context of the kind of pandemic. Barcelona has gone a bit further. They've talked about rediscovering the wonderful city with a whole new program of activities. And it's interesting that you look at what they say here, more than 150 activities, products and experiences. We'll come back to talk about the experiential dimension of tourism. And then Bordeaux, from my point of view, has gone even further. They're talking about responsible tourism as the main reason to go for a rewarding and eco-responsible getaway in Bordeaux. Now, Bordeaux has long been seen as a traditional city destination, but they're talking here about the experience of the gentle way of life of France's southwest, traveling in an ecological and sustainable way. They're focusing most of their relaunch on the idea of responsible tourism. So moving on, what do we mean by better tourism? I think a part of what we need to understand here is that tourism is a social construct. It's what we, the consumers, I'm a consumer of South African tourism, you're mostly producers. It's what we make it. And if it's what we make it, then we can change it. And some of the responsibility for that rests with the individual travellers who, as Krippendorf put it, and he's the father of responsible tourism, he put it, individual tourists build up or destroy human values by the way they travel. And he called for rebellious tourists and rebellious locals as the way to change the system. Where I think he was particularly far-sighted was in understanding that we weren't going to change travel and tourism just by regulations and prohibitions, that we needed to do it not through a bad conscience, but by the positive experience, not the feeling of compulsion, but that of responsibility. And I think that's where responsible tourism has hit and found traction with the changing market trend for more experiential forms of tourism. Tourism is a social activity. So the challenge for us is to use tourism to achieve sustainable development through tourism. And I guess one of the simplest ways for a politician or somebody responsible for a destination to understand what responsible tourism is to say that it's about whether the place, whether Gauteng will be used or whether it will use tourism. Will Gauteng use tourism to make lives better for local people, or will Gauteng be used by the tourism industry? That's the key question. Does Gauteng use tourism, or is it used by it? Obviously, we hope that it will use it. Now, one of the problems about tourism, and this is not a South African or an African point, it's a generic point about tourism, is that tourism makes extensive use of what are known by the political scientists as common pool or common property resources. It's the public realm, which we use for free. I live in a beautiful little market town in Kent, not far from London. We've had lots of day visitors coming just to wander around the streets to enjoy what can be seen in the public realm. Our shops, cafes and bars have all been closed. We've taken almost no money off them. but they've been able to enjoy these free products and to come for a day out bringing their sandwiches with them, leaving some litter behind, but making no contribution to the local economy. Lord Marshall, who was chair of British Airways when they launched the Tourism for Tomorrow Awards, said at the launch of those awards in 1994 that the travel and tourism industry is essentially the renting out for short-term lets of other people's environments, whether that's a city, a national park, a rainforest, it doesn't matter. The problem is that that renting out is done by the travel and tourism industry. They collect the rent, externalizing the costs to the public purse. Essentially, they're free riders. And we need to look at how tourism can put more back into maintaining these public resources, which tourism uses. Which brings us to the question of who manages the destination. It's clear that government holds the ring, as it does in all areas of social activity, between the consumers and the producers. But let's ask the more fundamental question about tourism being better for whom. I think it needs to be better for three distinct groups of people. It needs to be better for the citizens, the electors, the community. They get pride and income from tourism, the pride of being visited and the incomes that come and the investment values that come. The small town I live in has a much bigger range of restaurants than would be feasible given our small population. It's because we attract day visitors, evening visitors and tourists that we have a much more vibrant food economy than we'd otherwise have. Businesses need to benefit too clearly. They, after all, create the employment and the income, which benefits the communities. And obviously the tourists and the visitors also need to benefit, or else they'll not come to visit. But there is a question for you about who you want to invite. Who does Gauteng want to attract as visitors into the city? The choice of target market is obviously going to have real consequences for its existing businesses. So that decision needs to be made carefully. It's been absolutely clear in South Africa from the very beginning that it requires a whole of government approach. The destination, after all, is peopled by people who are represented by elected politicians and governed by the administrative production units. Every department of government, from planning to refuse disposal, has an impact on the way tourism is managed in the city and in the province. It's increasingly the case, I think, that the promotion of tourism and the management or governance of tourism are being separated. That's happening around the world now as DMOs, which were always slightly confusing about whether they were marketing or management. There's been a complete separation in many places now between the marketing and the management function, and the marketing is being used as part of the management function, so that the management function comes to be the dominant role in more and more places around the world. This is the UNWTO's formulation: travel, enjoy, respect. And respect is a core value of responsible tourism. Now, any success in improving and restoring and recovering tourism is going to rely on partnerships and collaboration. The competition, after all, for Gauteng and Johannesburg is from other destinations. It's not, the primary problem is not within the destination in terms of competition. The primary problem is that tourists can travel to other places. To make a vibrant destination, attractions, activities, the operators, the accommodation providers and the local communities need to work together, and they need to work together in a high degree of partnership. That partnership needs to be based on a shared goal, which in the end can, I guess, only be really developed through the governance structures and articulated by government, by shared investment, whether that's of time or money, or the willingness to share facilities with visitors, with shared risk, because all partnerships, all good partnerships are based on shared investment and shared risk, on a degree of equity, and clearly really important, the notion of inclusiveness in that tourism sector. You don't want to happen in South Africa what's happened in some parts of the Caribbean, where tourists largely stay within the resorts because there's no license to operate for the tourism industry outside of the resorts. So in responsible tourism terms, we're talking about using tourism to make better places for people to live in and better places for people to visit, but in that order. So we're talking about using tourism to achieve sustainable development through tourism, to use tourism rather than be used by it, to move from promotion to marketing in terms of the role of governance, and using marketing as a management tool. The expression there in red at the bottom, that tourism is like a fire, you can use it to cook your food on it, or it can burn your house down, is often heard in Southeast Asia. And there's a fundamental truth in that. It's not surprising that saying has prospered, survived and prospered for many years now. The realization of local benefits, of course, depends on the creation of employment at all skill levels, requires progression, additional incomes, additional facilities. It depends on the extent of linkages to the local economy. And the mantra for that is maximize the linkages and minimize the leakages. If we did more of that, then the economic benefit of tourism would increase dramatically for local communities and local destinations. But it isn't just about the money. It's also about pride and the sense of being known and having guests. And of course, the extent of local or non-local ownership of tourist enterprises makes a big difference to where the benefit goes. Small scale and low risk businesses are important to the tourism industry. In the UK, for example, the vast majority of the tourism industry is SMMEs. That isn't necessarily the case yet in South Africa, but it's an indication of a more mature tourism economy when you do have much more local ownership by small-scale entrepreneurs. So how do we make tourism better? Well, I think we have to accentuate the positive. We have to grow the positive, minimize the negative. We need to build meaning, and I'll say more about this, but tourism is about creating memories. That's what we bring back. That's the leave behind in the consumer's mind. That's what creates more business. We need to look at positive impact and reducing risk to improve the bottom line for businesses. We need to create sustainable business. And we need to accept that all forms of tourism can be more responsible, and that the alternative is to be irresponsible. It's no longer good enough to say that responsible tourism, ecotourism, is just the responsibility of the wildlife operators. It's simply not true. It never was true. It's not true now. It's a responsibility across the industry, the sector as a whole. So why this word responsibility? I'm not going to talk about this at length. That's a different lecture in many ways, a different presentation. But it's inherent in the notion of responsibility is the willingness to respond, to act, to do something. It requires action. And to create change, we have to acknowledge and own the problems and then take responsibility for fixing it. As the MD, the Managing Director of Shearing's Holidays, said to my students on one occasion in a seminar in the UK, you know, responsibility is free. You can take as much of it as you can handle. Handling it, of course, has some costs, but you don't have to go and buy responsibility. You can just take it and act on it. Now, this is the Cape Town Declaration from 2002. I'm going to do this very briefly, but the important point about the Cape Town Declaration was it grew directly out of the National Tourism Strategy of South Africa. I've tired of hearing tour operators, hoteliers telling me that the national policy would change. They've been telling me that since 1998. It hasn't changed. I don't believe it's going to change. I don't think there's any pressure in your society for that policy to be changed. The 1996 post-apartheid paper, white paper on tourism development in South Africa, is going to be with you for a long time. These principles in the Cape Town Declaration were drawn directly from the 1996 white paper. It's about minimizing negative impacts. It's about generating greater economic benefits for local people, enhancing their well-being, improving working conditions, and improving access to the industry, a more inclusive industry. The most difficult part of the Cape Town Declaration is probably this third point about involving local people in decisions that affect their lives and life chances. But that inevitably will come through the political process. You cannot ignore what local people feel about tourism. The fourth point is about making a contribution to the conservation of natural and cultural heritage. That grew directly out of research that I was doing in the late 90s on ecotourism around the world, some of it in Southern Africa and Zimbabwe. It was very hard to find anywhere where tourism was meeting the costs of its own visits to national parks. Effectively, they were being subsidized. There were negative contributions going in to the conservation of natural heritage. The fifth point, providing more enjoyable experiences, and I think critically important, meaningful connections with local people, a greater understanding of the local cultural and environmental context and the problems. Providing access for all, for people with disabilities and the socially disadvantaged. And a critical, important value for anybody who claims to be involved in responsible tourism is to have respect, to be culturally sensitive, and to show respect between tourists and hosts. So there's a critical difference, in my view, between sustainable tourism and responsible tourism. Sustainability is the aspiration. It's a bit of a fig leaf. That's a fig leaf, not a cannabis leaf, there in the top right. It's a vague and inescapable concept. It's really hard to define it. And generally, when people say it, they don't mean to do anything about it. Responsible tourism is the opposite. It's about defining the problem, defining what you're going to do about it, and then reporting what you've done and accepting that you are accountable and to blame for something. So if the problem is plastic pollution, you need to be seen to be doing something about it. You need to say what you're doing, and you need to report how successful you've been in doing it. It's about being transparent and accepting that you are accountable for what you do about the problem. I noticed that certification is on your agenda today. I could talk for a long time about this. I've restricted myself to the one slide. There's a problem about certification, and that is that it conflicts with one of the core values of responsible tourism, which is transparency. In the Responsible Tourism Awards every year in Africa and around the world, we see some great examples where businesses and destinations have said what they're doing, they've said why they're doing it, and they transparently report what they've done. That has real meaning. The problem with the current certification schemes is that they lack that meaning and they fail to engage consumers. So they're not seen as successfully contributing to the marketing of impact of most businesses. And that's why the take-up is still as low as it is. So if you talk about what we've got now as certification 1 or 1.0, there are three fundamental problems, I think. It's opaque. You can't tell whether a hotel that's got its certificate is careful about the way it uses water in a water-stressed area. You can't tell whether the hotel is treating its staff well. It's unenforceable. If I go into a hotel room and they put the temperature down at 15 degrees and they claim to be a 3-star green hotel, if I go to the desk and complain, I won't get any money back. They'll simply say, well, we didn't give ourselves the certificate, take it up with the certification agency. So they're unenforceable. And worst of all, I think, they communicate very little. There's no story in it. So what I think we need to do is to move to certification 2.0 or certification plus, where we have transparency about what the business is doing, about what they've achieved, where it's enforceable, so that because they're telling me what they've done, if I find they're not doing it, I can actually take it up with them and expect some monetary compensation, and it will be meaningful for guests. And that's the critical thing in responsible tourism generally, and in tourism marketing generally. What you're saying has to be meaningful for the guest if it's to have traction. So we're rapidly approaching the 20th anniversary of the Cape Town Declaration, which was in 2002. The Cape Town Declaration was built on the 1996 White Paper and on the Responsible Tourism Guidelines published by DEET in 1999. And let me remind you, Cape Town Declaration, although it took place a long way to the south of you, it was an official side event of the Johannesburg World Summit on Sustainable Development in 2002. Now, what we've seen since 2002 is the development of the Responsible Tourism Awards, which were first started in 2004, with lots of winners from Africa. We've seen the Responsible Tourism agenda grow at WTM Africa. Over the next couple of years, in April 2021 and 2022, there'll be an enhanced program of responsible tourism events at WTM Africa, with a day on responsible tourism this coming year in 2021. And then in November 2022, WTM London will be celebrating the 20th anniversary of responsible tourism. And South Africa and other countries in Africa and India and responsible tourism around the world will be featured there. I think there's a big opportunity for Gauteng to be a part of those responsible tourism celebrations as part of your efforts to move the industry on in 2022. To come then to the business case, because this may be the heart of it for many of you. One of the questions is who is the competition? There's competition for Africa. You only have to look at the map of the world. We know Africa is the most diverse continent. It's a place I'm completely hooked on. But many people will never come to Africa, may not choose to come to Gauteng, may not choose to come to Johannesburg. There is no one international market. There are many international markets, and you need to think hard in Gauteng about which markets it is that you want to attract. The second thing to say about this is that the market opportunity is, for me, pretty obvious. There's a trend towards experiential holidays, which we'll talk more about in a minute. There's a trend towards ethical and responsible consumption. People do not want to feel guilt about their holidays afterwards. You don't really want to compete on price. It makes a lot more sense to compete on other aspects of the product. It makes sense to offer richer and more meaningful experiences to attract people in the first place and to come back. And of course, if there's more to do in the destination and more to enjoy, you've got a better chance of extending stay, which is to everyone's advantage, the government of Gauteng as well as the people of Gauteng and the businesses. So what we've seen, and these are two books published by Harvard academics from the Harvard Business School, is we've moved from reliable supply through cost being the issue, through quality, and now the cutting edge is about authentic, real encounters and experiences. So what we're seeing really is a growth of experiential tourism and the growth of the experience economy. We're moving from value for money to experience for money. We're seeing people want to engage in with the culture, and they're seeking memorable experiences. But those memorable experiences can only be created by a shared product of host and guest. And what people are wanting is a quality and depth of experience to create those memories. And it's the memories which create the viral marketing. You can taste the difference in a holiday which has got experiences and responsible experiences at that. So there's a broad consumer trend to want the experience. Authenticity is a new strain of consumer desire. And in this, the guides act as teachers and interpreters. And Gauteng needs a diversity of guides. As Keith Henry, who's a Métis Native American in Canada, said to me in an interview I did with him recently, it's not about us without us. And that's something we feel strongly in Faversham too. We get blue badge guides come to Faversham with their coach tours. But actually, we'd much rather it was local people, the people here wearing the yellow sashes outside our little local museum, who we would rather were doing the guiding in our community and talking about Faversham as a place to live, as well as a place of historic relics. So think about it. You've got a product and experience and increased length of stay. You've got loyalty. You've got points of differentiation. You've got non-price competition, market segmentation, added relevance, guilt-free, and we all want better experiences. What's not to like about a responsible tourism approach? Now, I'm often asked what the business case is for responsible tourism, and I always answer that there isn't a business case. There are multiple cases. We should never forget that one of the motivations to do this is that it's the right thing to do. The second motivation is a set of things which are different for different aspects of the business. I would argue that responsible tourism is about minimizing risk. It's about license to operate. It's about the quality of the product. There are cost savings. There's staff morale as well. People are more likely to stay with the business which they feel is doing good for the local community. And we all know that training new staff is an expensive overhead for any business. Then there are the market advantage things. There's the richer, more authentic, guilt-free experience, and there's differentiation and PR that comes from the opportunity to build reputation, to generate referrals and repeats. So the opportunity of experiential tourism in Gauteng, I think, goes like this. I think the Constitutional Court is massively undervisited. It's left off too many people's itineraries. For many people, and certainly it was for me, I've been 2 or 3 times, I don't get to Joburg enough. But it's an eye-opening experience about the history of South Africa and the aspirations of your country. It's based in Gauteng. If it was in New York, it would be a top attraction. I don't think it actually is in Johannesburg. It's missed out of too many itineraries. And right there in that left-hand image, you've got something which tells you that you've got the degree of diversity within one country that France has within one country as well, although it doesn't have the linguistic diversity. But most countries struggle to attract visitors back to see so many different cultures and so many different parts of the country. You've also got this connection with human rights, with an international agenda which values diversity, values dignity, and values respect. You really ought to be making much more of the human rights side of what you've achieved in South Africa. I apologize for showing this because it's actually from Cape Town, obviously. I didn't have time to look for a Johannesburg or Gauteng example. But this is a really fascinating example of a township tour which is offering something which is still largely missing from the wine tours in the Cape, which is the opportunity to visit Black-owned wineries. I've had tourism experience with Coffee Bean Roots. They're extraordinary. They're extraordinary products too in Soweto and in Alexandria. So let's just talk briefly about experiences. I mean, it seems to me there's a problem here because some experiences are voyeuristic, and those first 2 photographs on the left-hand side of the slide are essentially the kinds of photographs you could get from a drive-by on a big coach. That contrasts with the immersive and engaging experiences which these 3 photographs demonstrate, these 3 on the right. Yeah, these are moments of engagement between local communities and the visitors. These are the memories that people would take back. Unless you think this is just a point that I'm making about South Africa, let me just show you 2 other experiences. This one is Kana in northern India. This is a cycling trip where you go off on your own to cycle around Kana National Park. Great opportunities with local communities. And the one on the next one I'm going to show you is actually from Tanzania. And it's a project which I was asked to go and evaluate. And I really wish that I'd been responsible for this project. But what you've got here is a group of tourists fresh off the plane in Tanzania. They've just arrived. First day. They've been on the overnight flight. They've just arrived. They've had lunch at the farmhouse, and then they've gone off, been divided into small groups. They've gone off with a coffee bean farmer, this guy, and they've been shown around his coffee bean plantation. And you can see they're immediately engaging with the local community and with each other. That formed the group brilliantly for the Dutch company that operated those tours. A great example of how that local engagement goes on from talking about coffee to talking about kids and kids' education and the problems of teenagers. The experiences make memories. I sadly have not yet managed to get to Little Africa, but people tell me about it all the time. And this is a meet the people opportunity, isn't it? Just like the main market on the Ramblas in Barcelona is. And then you've got the cradle of mankind presented in two completely different ways. This image here of the mound, the museum, is often shown in the marketing. But does that convey more meaning, or do the two examples of cave art demonstrate it? It's for you to say, it's your destination. But I know I'm much more attracted by the cave art than I am by a picture of the museum. Closer engagement then requires greater responsibility. Let me just repeat Keith Henry's point, this Métis Native American from Canada. If it's about us, it had better not be without us. I think we need all to remember that. License to operate is critical to the success of our businesses. Authentic, real encounters and experiences require a responsible approach. If Gauteng, I'm often told, if Gauteng does not work, the country doesn't work. And I think you need to consider the potential relationships between Gauteng and these under-visited provinces. I'm fascinated by Limpopo. I think it's the most extraordinary province. I've traveled very little in the Northwest or in the Northern Cape, but the main access really for these states around Gauteng are going to be through the Johannesburg airport. You need to think about how you grow your businesses by relating more to those other under-visited parts of your country. Thank you for listening. I'm gonna, I understand, be online to be able to answer some of your questions. I hope you have a good workshop. Thank you. Thanks for listening. I look forward to your questions.